We discussed this on our channel, The Apollo Detectives, and we've been contacted by several people who work at universities, people who work at major companies dealing with vacuum testing and vacuum experimentation. And they say, you're quite right. That is the effect of a vacuum on material. Photographic film outgasses quite easily. Photographic film is made of a plastic backing coated with light-sensitive emulsion. That's all a film is. And depending on the quality of the light-sensitive emulsion, you get good pictures. The light-sensitive emulsion started life as a liquid. You can see them mixing up in big tanks on Kodak or Agfa or Ilford or Fuji or any of the major manufacturers. They will all do it the same way. You put that film, once the emulsion has been dried, because obviously you're not going to want a wet emulsion in your camera, so it's dried, it's still light-sensitive. You put that in a vacuum, it starts to outgas. And the result of the outgassing on a relatively low level of vacuum is that the color balance of the film is completely destroyed. You increase the level of vacuum and the plastic backing becomes so brittle it will break inside a camera. But we never hear of that happening. All these 5,771 photographs allegedly taken on the lunar surface by the 12 named astronauts show no sign at all of any vacuum damage. So unless you can prove me wrong, I say those photographs were taken here on Earth under controlled studio conditions. Prove me wrong, guys. Come on. Can't be difficult. You know the answer. And if you prove me wrong, I'll hold my hand up and say I was wrong.
No, you're not. And the more I read about this, the more NASA documents I read about this, the more they too have a great concern about the effects of the vacuum of space and on anything that they send up there. I mean, any object. Of course, now it wouldn't be film because it's digital, but definitely on the surface of the craft that they're sending up, it is a major concern. They have tons of documents. They write extensively about it. It's not romanticized, you can't make a movie out of it. People are they're going to fall asleep during it, right? So they're not going to pay much attention to that. But when you read it, it's pretty eye-opening. Regarding the photos that were taken of the LRO back in 2009 of the Apollo landing sites, and I've gotten into a lot of back and forth with proponents on this. Recently, I got into another back and forth with a proponent of this, and he was using that to prove that the Apollo missions were real. Here's India's photos. China, of course, hasn't released its photos, but they say they did. So that's proof to the proponents, the fact that they don't see them, but China says they have them. And I guess now they believe China, but they didn't believe China before. And, and same with India, right? And then I look at photos that I've actually put in my book, and I don't spend a lot of time on the photo and film records. It's not my expertise, but you don't have to be an expertise to use your eyes and your common sense. And I look at photos, even going back to the orbiter you had mentioned that they were using back in the mid-1960s, that they were using to map the lunar surface for the Apollo missions, which was really to fake the Apollo missions. They needed to get a realistic set. You see photos that were produced from that mission that have absolute incredible clarity. And this is going back 55 plus years compared to what was produced by the LRO in 2009, specifically as it related to the Apollo landing sites. When you see other photos of the LRO outside of the Apollo landing sites on the lunar surface, when they're photographing other areas, you have immense detail. They were producing 3D images with enormous detail, but when it came to the Apollo missions, lo and behold, you got a little blur. I know nothing about photography, and I can Photoshop those landing sites a lot better than NASA did. And one interesting comment that I want to make is that, and this is to the proponent out there who's been blogging on my video, who said, I have posted a link on another video, actually. He was using this issue, the photos of the Apollo landing sites, as proof that they landed there. And I was trying to link a Google image of another photo taken by the LRO in 2009, not of the Apollo missions, but of the lunar surface, that had incredible resolution, clarity. I mean, you could see a grain of the regolith. You could see it, detail. And the link wouldn't take. And I kept trying to post the link and it wouldn't take. Do you think he would bother to go Google it himself? He refused. He absolutely refused. He says, I don't need to see that. And because he doesn't need to see it because he knows I'm right. If they can produce that image with the LRO in 2009, why can't they produce the same image with the Apollo landing sites, aside from their usual bogus arguments of, well, we're not up there to film the video or to take photographs of the landing sites. Hell, why not? This is supposed to be man's greatest scientific achievement. Why wouldn't you want to use some of that technology to take a better resolution shot of the landing sites? Well, I have an answer for that. And the answer is because they would have to show the degradation of the equipment on the moon from the elements of space in the last 50 plus years. And there's no way that they'd be able to duplicate that. It would be a guessing game. And anybody with even an amateur interest in astrophysics would be able to pick up on that lie. So they had no choice but to Photoshop it in a blurry kind of way and say, hey, look, proof that we have the Apollo landing sites, that we have photos, they landed there. That's why they don't show detail. That's why.
You're right. You're right. And to anybody who questions what we just said, what you've described very well, prove that it wasn't photoshopped. How can you prove it wasn't? Any more than we can prove it was, but we're making an educated guess based on points you've made. Now, every time I have a look at this, I usually compare what we see on the Apollo landing sites, which are basically a couple of pixels with a bloody great arrow pointing at them saying a lander, rover, flag. Well, the flag isn't there anymore, but where the flag was, equipment. You've got to have a big arrow to tell you what you're looking at. How do you know you're not looking at rocks? Anyway, if you can prove these are not photoshopped, I'd like to see it. Now, the equipment used on the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, so far as I'm aware, was able to resolve down to about 40 centimeters. 40 centimeters, about, 18 inches, a bit less. There's a commercial satellite called the GOI-1, commercial satellite, which orbits Earth, photographing for anybody who wants to buy any of the pictures that it takes. It presumably works for Google as well. If you look at your own house on Google Maps, you can see your car parked outside the front of the house. That's where it is. You can probably see if it's got a sunroof. I know I can, because my car's got a sunroof. One of the GOI-1 photographs was taken of the London Eye, about the same time as the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter photographs were taken of the Apollo landing sites. The GOI-1 photograph of the London Eye shows obviously the London Eye and the various pods that you travel in to go around. It's a great place to see London from, by the way. But what you can also see in this same photograph are people on the pavement, cars in the car park, sunroofs on some of the cars, which are, 3 foot wide, the most, 18 inches wide. You can see them quite clearly, and it's in color. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter photographs showing something the size of a pickup truck, which is what the lunar lander is supposed to be. You can see no detail in it at all. You can see a big shadow, which is helpful, but it's the wrong shadow. And the Indian photograph, that was discussed by Raza on that show, has 3 legs. Whoa, the lander has 3 legs. Yeah, I'll tell you what lander does have 3 legs, the Surveyor craft.
Yes. He emphasized that point with his opponent, who resorted going back to his default position of abusing Raza as opposed to actually debating Raza on that particular point. He ignored it.
Yeah, he did.
That for me was a very telling point. And yes, most of the comments on there gave that debate to MC Toon, but there was a lot of comments though that were actually giving it to Raza, and specifically on that point. And he might have mentioned something, but he was very flippant about it, right? And you can clearly see that too. You can clearly see what Raza was talking about. We're going to be going back to chapter 1 because there's a couple of points that I missed earlier, and I'd like to bring that up again with Marcus. So let's start with chapter 1. Let me read the quote to the reader. A common so-called proof of the moon landings offered by the pro-NASA group relates to the number of people who apparently worked on Project Apollo for NASA or one of its contractors. It is often stated in phrases such as, over 400,000 people were involved in Project Apollo in one way or another. How can the conspiracy theorists imagine that the secret about the hoax would not have been revealed in more than 50 years? And I hear that argument all the time from people, and you always have a very good response to that. So if you could elaborate on that.
Well, certainly. It's something I've heard about for many years because it's one of those apparently definitive proofs against Apollo being faked. And I'll say right from the beginning, Apollo never landed humans on the lunar surface. But 400,000 people worked on the Apollo program, either in NASA or the contractors around the place. And the contractors around the United States would include Boeing up in Seattle in Washington State, top left-hand corner of America, for those who are not there. They make aeroplanes as well, and they made the lunar rover in conjunction with General Motors. And then you come down to California, where you've got Rocketdyne, you've got Lockheed, you've got all the other contractors who are employed by NASA to build the various pieces of equipment required to get humans onto the moon, they thought. Then you go down to Texas, where you've got the control center known as Houston, because that's where it was. I believe it's now named the Lyndon Baines Johnson's Space Center or something like that, because he was the guy who provided all the money for it, because he was senator for Texas. So let's not say that money isn't involved. And then you come up to Florida, where the launch site is. And then you go up to New York, where you've got the Grumman Aircraft Company making the lunar landers. And you go across to Connecticut, where you've got companies making the spacesuits. International Latex Corporation, otherwise known as Playtex. They were making the spacesuits because they were used to building or making things which would flex as human body moved. You go across to Illinois, where you've got other companies. One of the original ideas behind Apollo was to spread the money across the country. And I think we just demonstrated that the major contractors did it. Now, these major contractors, they're big companies. They employ a lot of people. Not all of them were working on Apollo, but 400,000 of them apparently were working for Apollo. That's the figure that is generally agreed as being the number who were working on the Apollo program in the mid to late 1960s. Probably the most were working on it in 1965. That's where the most money was spent. Now, in addition to those 400,000 people, you've got their families, you've got their friends, you've got the direct relations with them. And they would almost certainly have known that their friend, their father, their brother, their cousin, their uncle was working on Apollo, because it was a proud thing to be doing. This was honoring the now dead President John Kennedy's challenge to land humans on the moon. So I would put the figure near at 2 million rather than 400,000 who knew what was going on. Because all these people had families, whether they were married or not. They had mothers, fathers, uncles, brothers, cousins, all the rest of it. So a large number of people in America were aware of what was going on. And that was quite normal. This was to be expected. And they, as the rest of the world did, watched the launch of Apollo 11 on July the 16th, 1969. We all watched it. And we're told 650 million people watched that launch and watched the Apollo 11 activities over the next 8 days. So the idea that 400,000 people could keep a secret is such complete and utter nonsense. It hardly bears discussing. But I think we should discuss it because it's such a theory produced by so many people. And there are people like, get this, Professor Anu Ojha, director of the National Space Centre in the UK. Quote, how could so many people keep a secret, unquote. Then you've got the UK Institute of Physics making a similar comment. Then you've got Dr. Laura Danley, the curator of the Griffith Observatory in California. And you've got Ruth Langsford, who is a TV presenter on the independent television in the UK, who says, personally, for me, I just think far too many people would have had to have covered it up for so many years to have never slipped up. USA Today's make a similar comment. Rick Feinberg, the press officer of the American Astronomical Society, who says about 400,000 scientists, engineers, technologists, machinists, electricians worked on the Apollo program. That's true. If, in fact, the main motivation for believing in the moon hoax, that is, you don't trust the government, you don't trust our leaders, you don't trust authority, how can you feel that 400,000 people would keep their mouths shut for 50 years? It's just implausible. No, it's not. They didn't have to keep their mouths shut. This is the whole point. They didn't have to keep their mouths shut because they had no secret to keep. They were doing the very best job they could. And I think it's an insult to claim that they were working to hoax the Apollo program. They weren't doing that. They worked long hours. Their lives were upended in some cases by the number of hours they worked on the Apollo program. So the idea that they were keeping some sort of dark secret is just so much nonsense. It's fiction. Forget it. It doesn't work. And if anybody can prove that I'm wrong when I say that, I want to hear about it, because nobody has yet shown that that is the case, that 400,000 people kept a secret. No, they didn't. It's called compartmentalization. That's how you keep secrets in the military. You know enough to do your own job and nothing more. It's a standard military procedure. That wasn't applied in Apollo. There was cooperation. There were a lot of people desperately trying to work out how the hell we were going to get humans onto the lunar surface. The truth is, they didn't get humans onto the lunar surface because they couldn't. There was no conspiracy about it. It was just engineering. It was just the conditions in space are so grotesque for humans. So if anybody was going to blow the whistle, an English expression for let the cat out of the bag, they might have done it. But they wanted to see the success of the Apollo missions, as we all did at the time. We were all caught up in this hoopla and this PR and this Disneyfication of space, because that's what it was. Oh, by the way, Stanley Kubrick had nothing to do with it. He was far too busy making his masterpiece, 2001: A Space Odyssey. So forget Kubrick being involved. He wasn't.
Interesting, because that's what a lot of people will actually come back and use that and say, when you say Stanley Kubrick's involved and there's no proof of that, well, he wasn't involved. And that solves that problem right there. When you were talking there, I was thinking about whistleblowers, and you mentioned that just a few minutes ago. And the argument has been, well, people higher up within the organization of NASA, higher up in the management, never came forward. Somebody surely would have come forward and blown the whistle. But a lot of people don't seem to understand, Marcus, I'm sure you would agree, is that these whistleblowers would never get anywhere near the likes of CNN or Fox News to reveal a story. It would never be aired. I mean, because the mainstream media was part and parcel to the cover-up and charade that was going on here. And when I hear, whistleblowers coming forward, having said that, when somebody does come forward, like Bill Casey came forward and disclosed what he saw while he was working within the program from 1958 to 1963, he got ridiculed and mocked for decades. And then you have the other argument where they will say, well, if the Soviets knew about this, and they knew about it, they would have come forward. Well, no, they wouldn't. And the thing is that when a Russian scientist does come forward, which we'll discuss soon, to disclose the Apollo moon hoax through their knowledge and their scientific research, they're ridiculed as being, oh, well, he doesn't really exist. These are not real scientists. So you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So my argument is to the people who want to ridicule the whistleblowers, are you telling me, you telling all of us that you actually need confirmation from politicians who actually lie all the time? That's what their careers are based on, lying to the public. And you're waiting for them to validate. You're waiting for a Russian politician, Vladimir Putin, to validate the Apollo moon landings. That says a lot about your mentality out there for the people who say that constantly, right? So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it's a good point you make there. And you mentioned the Russians, or the Soviets as they were known then, the Soviet Union. And that's one of the other ideas put forward by people who say, well, if it was fake, the Russians would have blown the whistle. They would have exposed America for faking it without looking into the politics. Because if Russia did know, and it's pretty certain now that they were fully aware of the problems, they may not have known them at the time, but they know them now. It's far more profitable for the Soviet Union to shut up about it and blackmail America than it is to expose them, because once you've exposed them, you've lost your leverage. You can't have an effect if you've exposed it. I mean, that's how blackmail works. Maybe it's an unpleasant word, is blackmail, but that's what was going on. The Soviet Union were desperate. Now, there's a point about the Soviet Union. They have one major export commodity, natural gas. They're sitting on it. There are huge gas fields in the Soviet Union, mainly in Siberia. Before Apollo 8, the Soviet Union entered a contract, signed contracts with West Germany, as it was then, Hungary, Italy, and Austria to export their natural gas into those markets so they would gain foreign currency income, because the future of the Soviet Union was at stake. They just fought World War II. This is less than 20 years after the end, or just over 20 years after the end of World War II, where Russia lost 30 million people. They were devastated. Their industry was devastated. the Soviet hierarchy were desperate for some way in which they could benefit from their own natural gas, so they sold it into Europe. We've seen in recent years the effect of cutting off the supply of Russian natural gas, and it's basically decimated the German economy because Germany were relying on it. These contracts to supply the export of Russian natural gas were signed in September 1968, a few months before Apollo 8 took off. That was December 1968. The idea that America were fooling the world by launching these 3 astronauts who read from the book of Genesis, and they orbited the moon, Apollo 8. They didn't land, they orbited the moon because they had been spooked by the Russian Luna 15, I think it was, which was basically an unmanned craft, but it had a tape recorder on board which could be activated from Russia, where they started a commentary as if there was astronauts on board the craft. Russia's very good at chess. So they fooled America into thinking that they had sent humans, Soviet Union, cosmonauts, to orbit the moon just prior to Apollo 8. So America got thoroughly spooked by this and decided they would have to do it as well. So they sent Apollo 8 up. But Apollo 8, the rocket, the Saturn V rocket, had never been tested with humans on board, let alone going to the moon, and they hadn't tested the heat shield to come back with. You need a heat shield, slow down, remove the energy of the re-entry of the command module into Earth's atmosphere. It's only 60 miles up. You've got to get it right or you'll crash into the Earth and go splat and you're a pancake. You're coming back at 25,000 miles an hour. They hadn't tested that. They didn't know they could do it. It was a huge risk for America to do that. But Russia didn't call them out on it. They congratulated them and said, well done, guys. I think that was more a sarcastic commentary than it was real. The Soviet Union were not about to expose America. It was in their interests to maintain the idea that America had succeeded in doing what they claimed to have done. The fact that they didn't succeed in anything they claimed to do in landing humans on the moon, look at the trouble they're having getting back 50 years later. Oh dear, oh dear. I mean, it's sad. Well, it would be sad if it wasn't so funny. I think it's very funny because they're being exposed gradually. There's a gradual exposure of the fraud of Apollo. So the Soviet Union knew perfectly well what was going on. They had enough technology to be able to identify. And being clever, the Russians used Jodrell Bank in the UK, a big radio telescope in the UK, to listen in to the Soviet landers or the Soviet craft going to the moon. And they were reporting it. So that was considered to be an honest report, which it was. They reported what the Soviet Union were doing. It was a very clever move, that, because you can't then turn around and say, well, Jodrell Bank are in on it too. No, Jodrell Bank were totally independent, and they were working with the full knowledge of the British and the American governments to track the Soviet craft. Clever move, that. Again, chess players.
Very interesting. And one of the points you just made caught my ear. I won't get into this too much because I'd like to move on to the next chapter. But before we do, you mentioned the Apollo 8. They were spooked basically into that fictitious manned mission. And when you talked about the lack of testing, which is something I focus on a lot in my first book, you reminded me there was only 4, if I'm not mistaken, there was only 4 actual testing of the heat shield in actual conditions for the command module. I forget the name, the designation of the 2 missions, but there was the first 2 missions, then there was Apollo 4 and Apollo 6. And 3 out of those testing are questionable. Apollo 4, maybe in terms just of the heat shield. Now, I'm not talking about the engines, which we'll get into in a moment, but just in terms of the heat shield, the data is questionable. So when you think about that, they put a crew on board Apollo 8 after 4 missions to test the heat shield in actual conditions with questionable data. And you can look that up. I've talked about it in my second book, and I've sourced that material. There's one point that I would like to talk to Marcus about here, and that is chapter 2, Marcus, page 25.
Okay.
And it's the second paragraph, and I'm going to read it out loud. The question is, could the simulations have been realistic enough to convince the general public and the mission controllers? The best evidence we have is from the people who were involved at the time. For example, the words of the Apollo 11 flight director, Gene Kranz, also flight director for every odd number Apollo mission. And his quote is this, and this is what I found fascinating. Quote from Gene Kranz: "The simulations were so real that no controller could discern the difference between the training and the real mission," unquote.
I think that says it all, don't you?
Doesn't it? I mean, it really does. So, Marcus, let's move on to chapter 3. So we'll start with the first paragraph on page 30. "Notwithstanding the technological achievement of designing and building this rocket, doubts have been expressed concerning its ability to achieve the moon landings. We are not experts on the power of rockets, so we will leave it up to those better informed to express an opinion. However, in this detailed analysis by Russian scientist S.J. Pogrovsky of the Saturn V rocket from the Apollo 11 mission, posted on allos.com from this Russian scientist, the velocity achieved at the separation point was found to be significantly 800 to 1100 meters per second lower than that required to satisfy the stated flight plan. This finding implies that the declared payload needed for a return lunar mission could not have been propelled to the moon." Now, he makes a very significant point there, and this is, again, to the proponents that are looking for whistleblowers. You have one right here. He's a Russian scientist. He's not a Russian politician. Strange that you seem to want to have validation from a Russian politician who are just like our politicians. He's a Russian scientist, and he's not going to get his article reviewed in Scientific America. He's not going to get that reviewed. They're not going to touch that article, right? But nonetheless, he's a Russian scientist, very qualified in his field, and he makes a very significant point here. The chief separation point was found to be significantly lower, 800 to 1100 meters per second lower than that required. Actually, is he saying that the Saturn V rocket was climbing slower?
Yeah.
It was at a slower speed?
Yes.
Yes, and that's what he's saying.
Yeah, because there was one film that was taken of the launch of the Apollo 11 Saturn V rocket, which followed it from ignition, i.e. on the ground, to when it disappeared from sight. It was about a just over 2-minute long film, followed the whole of the launch of the rocket. And it was a complete film. There were no cuts in it. So it was possible to measure the height and the speed because there were certain points in the film, such as the cloud level, which were known to exist. I think the cloud was at 30,000 feet, which is about the height of Everest, just under 6 miles. So you could calculate the speed from launch to the cloud base at 30,000 feet. And if it was launching at a certain speed, it would take X number of seconds to get there. It's possible to calculate all this. And he's saying that either the engines were not as powerful as we were told, or it was not carrying as much weight as we were told. Therefore, if it was not carrying enough weight, was it carrying as much as NASA claimed, i.e. 46 tons, to go into lunar orbit? Or was it less? And if it was less, what was taken off? What was missing? And the work you've done on the Saturn V engine and its ability to achieve those velocities, I think is very valuable because that's part of it. That's part of the whole calculation. And if they show, as
S.G. Krosky, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
And he's a scientist. He's quite an eminent scientist in the Soviet Union. Yes. He knows what he's talking about. And this is the point now when people say, oh, Russia ought to have blown the whistle. They didn't have access to the information until quite recently. They certainly didn't have access to the information around the time of Apollo itself. It was only when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Russian Federation took over, the Russian scientists could access this information basically on the internet, unedited, and they could examine it, which is what they've been doing. And a lot of Russian scientists, Russian filmmakers, Russian physicists, even Russian rocket engineers have examined the evidence of Apollo, which we can access quite normally. I mean, the last 25 years we've been able to access it, since 1999. They have as well. And they're fascinated by it. And almost without exception, they say fake, fraud, fiction. Yeah. That's what they say. Why would they say that? They're not going to benefit from saying that. Just being honest as scientists and as filmmakers. That famous Mythbusters episode where they try to demonstrate how it was all perfectly normal. You know, any idea that it was faked is ridiculous. And Russian filmmakers said, okay, let's recreate what Mythbusters have done. Let's see how they got there. And the only way they could get there, the Russians could get there, was wearing a white jacket to get enough light reflected onto the little miniature lander and the miniature Lego type spaceman. It's the only way they could do it. They say, well, it was fake. It wasn't Mythbust at all. It was fake filmmaking, 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 filmmaking.